In the dense, wind-whipped forests of upstate New York, a discovery in 1862 shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Beneath the rotting floorboards of an abandoned church, 143 unmarked graves were unearthed. The air was thick with the damp stench of decay as forensic teams examined the remains. Each skeleton bore the grotesque signature of prolonged suffering, healed fractures, signs of drowning and revival, and deep, ritualistic carvings etched into their bones with cruel precision. Federal records regarding the site, later known as Ravenwood, remained sealed for over 160 years. Only those with the highest levels of clearance ever glimpsed the full extent of what had taken place within that isolated religious enclave. But recently uncovered documents, long buried in the National Archives, now pull back the veil on what may be the darkest cult in American history. At the heart of this darkness were three brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft. The names alone still echo through whispered local legends, etched into the nightmares of those who grew up near the forgotten woods. The brothers believed, and convinced hundreds of others to believe, that pain was the only true path to purity. That salvation lay not in prayer, but in suffering. The story begins decades before the graves were discovered deep in the 1800s, when the town of Ravenwood was little more than a cluster of homesteads tucked between moss-covered hills and shadow-choked pine. Founded in 1803 by settlers fleeing the crowded Hudson Valley, Ravenwood promised isolation and renewal. To the outside world, it was idyllic, a place where God's silence seemed to hum through the trees. But the silence was not God's. By the early 1820s, the region had earned the nickname the Burned-Over District, not for its literal flames, but for the waves of religious fervor that consumed it. Revivalist preachers, new sects, and apocalyptic movements took root here like invasive vines. It was into this fertile madness that the Ravencroft brothers arrived. They came not as strangers, but as saviors. Elder Ezra Ravencroft, then 42, radiated authority. He spoke with a voice that rang like thunder in a tin chapel, his presence so heavy it seemed to bend the very air. His sermons were slow, deliberate, laced with dread and awe. He promised deliverance not from sin, but from the flesh itself. His younger brother, Deacon Silas, was the mind behind the madness. Slender, bespectacled, always scribbling in leather-bound journals, Silas quoted obscure scriptures and apocryphal texts with surgical precision. He constructed the theology, fusing Christian penance with esoteric mysticism. He wrote of blood as the ink of the soul, and of bones as the true vessels of the spirit. Then there was Prophet Caleb, the youngest. With pale blue eyes and a smile that never reached them, Caleb was both beautiful and terrifying. Locals said he could make the dead weep and the living die. The winter of 1826 was the coldest Ravenwood had seen in over a decade. The river froze solid, crops withered in their storehouses, and sickness swept through the town like a ghost in the fog. Among the many it took, the disease claimed the family of Margaret Alcott, her husband, Thomas, and their two children, Emma and James. In the silence that followed the funerals, Margaret wandered her home like a ghost. The laughter that once echoed off the walls had been replaced by the ticking of the mantel clock, and at night, the sound of her own breath felt intrusive. Grief didn't just settle in her bones, it became her shadow. Neighbors pitied her, but no one knew what to say. Some offered prayer. Others brought food. None could reach the place where she had retreated inside herself. It was on one of those gray afternoons in early spring, while walking aimlessly through the market square, that she first saw Elder Ezra Ravencroft. Tall, austere, and dressed in black wool despite the warming air, he stood beneath a sycamore tree speaking softly to a cluster of followers. His voice was calm and deep, yet carried an unmistakable weight. Margaret couldn't hear his words, only felt their rhythm. But when he turned and looked at her, everything else vanished. He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts, she would later write in a journal discovered by federal investigators. He told me my suffering had meaning. That it was preparing me for a greater purpose. No one had spoken to her like that in months, not with sympathy, but with certainty. And perhaps that was what she craved most. She followed him back to the modest wooden chapel on the edge of the forest, unsure why, unable to stop. When she crossed its threshold, the scent of burning cedar and wild sage filled her lungs. Candles flickered along the walls. A carved symbol, a spiral woven into a flame, hung above the altar. The Church of the Pure Spirit, they called it. Margaret didn't return home that night. Or the next. By the third day, the townspeople had stopped asking. By the summer of 1827, the church had grown from a handful of drifters and seekers to nearly 100 devoted members. Its teaching spread through whispered conversations and midnight baptisms. Some built small homes near the church, forming what came to be known as the Outer Circle. Others continued living in town, but spent their days entirely within the compound. At the heart of it all stood the Ravencrofts' elder Ezra, the visionary and voice of the Spirit, and Deacon Silas, his younger brother, a stern and silent man who handled discipline and structure. While Ezra offered hope, Silas enforced the path to it. Their message was deceptively simple: the flesh is weak, the spirit eternal. Pain is not punishment, it is purification. Margaret took to the teachings with a fervor that surprised even herself. She memorized scripture, fasted for days, and led prayer circles. Her grief, which once threatened to. The stage was set for darkness to descend upon the Church of the Pure Spirit. Winter had wrapped its frigid arms around Ravenwood by the time the transformation began. Trees stood bare, skeletal against a slate-gray sky, and the wind carried whispers that seemed to echo from another world. In the heart of this forgotten town, the church stood like a monolith, silent, still, and steeped in secrets. It was in those early days that Prophet Caleb, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned with something between madness and divine purpose, gathered his closest brothers. According to documents unearthed decades later, Caleb had whispered, "The sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." To the outside world, the Church of the Pure Spirit was an oddity but nothing more, an isolated religious commune, self-sufficient, mysterious, but peaceful. Yet beneath that surface was a darkness that few could imagine. The people of Ravenwood would soon discover that the Ravencroft brothers' definition of shepherd was not rooted in protection, but in sacrifice. The slow descent into horror could be traced to a single date, December 21, 1829. The winter solstice. The longest night of the year. According to secret church records, scrawled in ink and blood, hidden in hollowed floorboards and behind false walls, this night marked the first ascension. It would become the blueprint for everything that followed. That morning, a thick blanket of snow coated the landscape. Birds had gone silent. The air held a stillness so absolute, it seemed even time hesitated. Elder Ezra, Caleb's right hand and the public voice of the church, summoned the entire congregation for an evening revelation. The faithful obeyed without question. They had come to revere Ezra's words and Caleb's visions with blind devotion. Over the months, they had given up worldly possessions, families, even their names. They were now the chosen, purified by faith, bound by the sacred spiral. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, 148 followers gathered inside the church. The building, always cold, felt more like a tomb that evening. There were no windows. No clocks. Only 12 large candles lit in a perfect spiral across the wooden floor, converging toward a raised central platform. Each candle's flame flickered as though alive, responding to something unseen. Among the congregation was Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith who had joined 6 months earlier after losing his wife to consumption. Grief had hollowed him, made him vulnerable to promises of rebirth. Now, he stood at the outer edge of the spiral, shivering not from cold, but from something deeper. A gnawing sense that he no longer belonged to himself. As the last candle was lit, Elder Ezra emerged from the shadows. His robes, deep crimson, dragged along the floor as he stepped into the center of the spiral. His voice cut through the silence, soft at first, almost reverent. Tanai. They called it the path to ascension. Not a legend, not a metaphor, just sacred law. Inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, built like a dark cathedral against the northern sky, no one questioned its truth. Not the congregation. Not the elders. And certainly not the three who would endure it. Rain hammered the earth that night. Thunder rolled over the hills of Ravenwood as if the heavens themselves were warning against what was to come. But inside the chapel, candlelight flickered against the stone walls, and silence settled like dust. The congregation had gathered. Their heads were bowed. Their breath shallow. And at the front, kneeling beneath the altar's shadow, were the chosen, Thomas, Lydia, and Jonah. Young, fragile, willing. At the pulpit stood Elder Ezra Ravencroft, arms outstretched, robes soaked at the hem from rain or blood, no one could tell. His eyes burned with conviction. Sin, he began, voice like gravel and smoke, clings to flesh like rot to fruit. But tonight, the vessel shall be scraped clean. He turned toward the 3 initiates. You shall pass through 7 gates. 7 trials. You shall emerge pure or not at all. And so it began. The first was the trial of air. Wet cloths were laid across their faces. Buckets of water passed hand to hand in silence. Ezra raised a hand, and the ritual commenced. Water flowed over cloth, seeping into mouths, nostrils, lungs. Panic took them. Their bodies writhed. Hands struggled against their bindings. There was no breath. No mercy. The sensation of drowning was real, crafted with surgical cruelty. Ezra intoned ancient scripture as the congregation chanted in harmony. As breath gave way to unconsciousness, the water ceased. Cloths were removed. The 3 coughed, gasped, vomited. They had been brought to the brink. And that was just the beginning. Next came the trial of earth. Outside, the rain had softened the ground into thick, hungry mud. 3 pits had been dug in advance. Long, narrow, and waiting. The deacons dragged the chosen across the wet grass. Thomas sobbed, pleading. Lydia stared blankly. Jonah whispered prayers to no God that would answer. They were buried to their necks in the mud packed tight with cold earth. Only their heads remained visible, their eyes wild and rolling. Ezra knelt before them. To know stillness, he whispered, one must taste the grave. Hours passed. Rain drizzled down their faces. Their teeth chattered. Their minds cracked. One began to hum a hymn out of rhythm. Another muttered names no one recognized. When the soil was finally removed, they could no longer stand. Their legs trembled. Their lips were blue. But they were not dead. The trial of fire followed. Inside, a brazier glowed in the chapel's center. From it, metal rods protruded, each tipped with a sacred mark, each red with heat. Ezra held one up, brandishing it like a sword. Pain is the pen with which the soul is rewritten, he declared. Thomas was the first to be branded. The M. Few who walked the grounds of the Church of the Pure Spirit ever suspected what lay beneath its hallowed floors. Located deep in the forests of upstate New York, it presented the perfect image of peace: white clapboard walls, a small bell tower, and a congregation known for humility and kindness. Prophet Caleb Ravencroft's sermons were legendary, filled with passion and fire. Outsiders saw a man of vision. Insiders saw a messenger of God. But beneath the floorboards of the sanctuary, behind a locked iron door hidden in the cellar, began a descent into unspeakable horror. 3 underground chambers defined the Ravencroft cult's darkest doctrine: the Chamber of Trials, the Chamber of Ascension, and the Chamber of Saints. Each one more horrific than the last. The Chamber of Trials. The first chamber, chiseled directly into the cold granite beneath the church, was a windowless dungeon lit only by torchlight. A foul dampness clung to the air, and the walls bore deep scratch marks, etched by the desperate hands of the faithful undergoing what was called the 7 purification tortures. These weren't symbolic gestures of devotion. They were real. And they left permanent scars. Trial 1 was fire. A branding iron, heated until it glowed white, was pressed against the shoulder, searing flesh in the shape of the Ravencroft sigil, a spiral sun. The pain was said to ignite the soul. Trial 2, air, involved wet cloth and slow water, a cruel simulation of drowning. The deacons would chant as the initiate thrashed beneath their grip, just barely kept alive. Trial 3, earth, saw initiates buried beneath soil in shallow boxes for hours at a time. You could scream, but no one would hear. 4 was the trial of blood. Sanguine sacrifice. A controlled cut down the forearm, the blood collected and anointed on the elder's robes. 5 was silence. Days of complete isolation, no light, no sound, only a bowl of water and stale bread pushed through a slit in the wall. Some emerged babbling. Others didn't emerge at all. 6. The trial of pain. Teeth pulled without anesthetic. Fingernails removed. And through it all, you were told to smile. You were told to thank them. And lastly, Trial 7, Submission. You were brought before the elders, stripped of name, identity, and will. You knelt and said only one phrase. I am nothing but the vessel. Those who passed all 7 trials were declared purified. They were given robes of red and white. They were honored. They were led into the next chamber. Many didn't survive. Those who did, were broken. The Chamber of Ascension. Unlike the brutal starkness of the trial chamber, the Chamber of Ascension was eerily serene. Circular in shape, the chamber was built to resemble a womb, symbolizing rebirth. A black stone altar sat at its center, carved from obsidian and veined with milky streaks that gleamed in torchlight. On this altar, the final ritual took place. Those brought here were told they had reached. I remember the first time I crossed the threshold of the sanctuary beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The air was thick with incense and candle smoke, the scent of burning myrrh curling around my throat like a serpent. Shadows danced on the stone walls, and strange symbols had been carved into every surface, symbols we were told not to question, only to revere. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and awe. I remember weeping not from terror, but from what I believed was religious ecstasy. I had been chosen, allowed to bear witness to an elevation. I thought I had touched the divine. Now those same tears shame me beyond words. As the years passed, the ceremonies became more frequent. At first, they were hidden behind heavy oak doors in silence. In 1830, according to the church's meticulous records, later seized by federal agents, only 2 elevation ceremonies occurred that year, each resulting in several deaths. 5 souls, to be exact. Their names were never announced aloud, only recorded in red ink in the Book of Ascendants, which none but the inner circle were permitted to see. By 1835, the ceremonies had increased to once every 3 months. The deaths no longer startled the congregation, they became ritual, part of the divine order. Each season demanded its sacrifice, 2 to 4 lives offered to the unseen spirit the Ravencroft brothers preached about with unshakable conviction. And then, in 1840, something shifted. Elevations became monthly events. Every full moon, the bells rang out across Ravenwood, and the chosen were gathered. Special ceremonies were held on solstices and equinoxes, days when the spirit was said to be closest to our world. On those sacred nights, the death toll was higher. Sometimes 6. Sometimes 9. They called it the purification. The Ravencrofts were not madmen, at least, not in the way outsiders might assume. Elder Ezra, the eldest, was the voice of God, firm and unwavering. His sermons could silence even the most rebellious heart. Deacon Silas was the theologian, quiet and deliberate, author of the Ravencroft Codex, a document more feared than the Holy Bible itself. And Prophet Caleb, he was the Spirit's vessel. Caleb was younger than his brothers but far more dangerous. He spoke in riddles and dreams, often vanishing into the woods for days only to return with eyes bloodshot and shaking hands. He claimed to receive visions directly from the Spirit, and over time, the others began to believe him. So did we. Especially when those he blessed during elevations began to die in exactly the manner he had foreseen, spasming, gasping, eyes rolled back in rapture. In the beginning, the Ravencrofts were cautious in selecting candidates for elevation. They chose orphans, widows, drifters, people no one would miss. The town of Ravenwood was remote, and most families minded their own business. A missing beggar? A dead traveler? Tragic, yes. But not enough to warrant suspicion. But as their By the year 1840, the Church of the Pure Spirit stood at the height of its influence, and its inner sanctum had become a theater of horrors cloaked in the language of divine purpose. At its center was Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, a man who had once radiated calm spiritual authority but now wandered the church's candlelit corridors with ink-stained fingers, sunken eyes, and muttering lips. It was during this period that Caleb took full control over the rites of elevation. No longer were such decisions shared among the Ravencroft brothers or subject to divine vote. Caleb alone selected the candidates, orchestrated the rituals, and documented their outcomes in a series of unsettling journals hidden within a false panel behind a bookshelf in his private quarters. The journals, later recovered by investigators decades after the cult's fall, charted a descent not just into madness, but into something more alien and terrifying. His writings began as spiritual observations but devolved into anatomical charts scribbled over with indecipherable symbols, blood smudges, and fragments of prayers written backward. One particularly disturbing entry from 1842 reads, "The Spirit has revealed that the soul is not singular in its seat. It is not bound to the heart, nor confined to the mind. It is fractured, fragmented, distributed throughout the body in what I have termed divine nodes. Each elevation is a cartographic journey through flesh. Each incision brings me closer to the map of God. Soon I shall have the complete divine anatomy." These thoughts were not metaphorical for Caleb. He genuinely believed that through his gruesome rituals, through pain, death, and dissection, he was uncovering the architecture of the soul itself. Every person elevated was, in his eyes, a page of a sacred manuscript bound in blood and bone. As the years passed and church membership swelled to nearly 300, so too did the frequency of the rituals. The Ravencrofts faced a logistical problem: what to do with the mounting bodies of the elevated, those deemed to have fulfilled their divine potential through sacrifice. Caleb saw this not as an obstacle but as an opportunity. In his sermons, he began speaking of offering vessels to the world, claiming their remains would continue to serve the Spirit in death. Most of the congregation interpreted this spiritually. They did not know that Deacon Silas Ravencroft, the eldest brother and a former scholar of anatomy, had begun a chilling enterprise: the covert sale of human remains to medical schools. At the time, mid-19th century medical institutions were desperate for cadavers. Laws restricted the use of bodies for study primarily to executed criminals, and the supply was grossly insufficient for the needs of rapidly expanding colleges. This void birthed a grim black market, one populated by so-called resurrectionists, men who dug up fresh graves or bribed officials at poorhouses to obtain unclaimed corpses. Silas had. By the late 1840s, the Church of the Pure Spirit had become a cornerstone of Ravenwood society. To outsiders, it was a flourishing religious commune, orderly, industrious, and peaceful. Visitors marveled at the immaculate gardens, the perfectly synchronized work routines, and the angelic songs that echoed from the chapel each morning. They wrote glowing letters home, speaking of a community touched by divine grace. But under this immaculate surface festered a far darker truth. The Ravencroft brothers, Caleb, Silas, and Josiah, were revered as spiritual visionaries, shepherds guiding lost souls to salvation. Their followers bowed before them not out of obligation, but with trembling awe, as if proximity to these men drew them closer to heaven. In truth, it only pulled them closer to the abyss. The church compound had grown far beyond its original wooden chapel. Now it included vast dormitories for the unmarried, neatly spaced family cottages, artisanal workshops where followers crafted religious goods for sale, and even a modest school where children learned a version of scripture tailored by the brothers themselves. Beneath this surface, quite literally, lay a vast labyrinth of underground chambers, accessible only to the inner circle. It was in these hidden depths that the Ravencrofts practiced their true faith. By day, the compound buzzed with hymns and harvests. By night, it whispered with invocations to something far older than any god named in their sermons. The brothers believed, or claimed to believe, that purity could only be achieved through pain and surrender. The term elevation was coined to describe a process no outsider ever witnessed and no initiate ever survived. The chambers were cold and lined with stone, their air damp and perfumed with iron. Here, rituals took place under torchlight. Symbolic trials meant to purge sin, though they bore more resemblance to torture than penance. Followers selected for elevation were praised, lauded, and then never seen again. Their absence was always explained away. "He has gone to commune with the Spirit," Caleb would tell the congregation. "She walks among angels now," Silas would whisper, tears in his eyes. And the people, groomed by years of conditioning, nodded and smiled, desperate for their own moment of ascension. The community outside the church walls was not blind. Local townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the Ravencroft brothers, though none dared to confront them. Even the sheriff, a man once known for his blunt courage, avoided the church grounds after sunset. Some said he had once entered those underground chambers and emerged 3 days later, mute and shaking, with white hair and a face a decade older. Still, the brothers' grip on Ravenwood tightened. Caleb, the eldest, was the prophet, the voice of their divine mission. He preached with such conviction that even skeptics sometimes found themselves questioning what they knew to be real. Silas handled the operation's logistics. The first thread in the unraveling of the church's carefully woven illusion began in 1847, quietly, almost innocently. James Thornhill, a diligent postal inspector known for his methodical nature, had been investigating a series of financial discrepancies in several rural towns across upstate New York. What he uncovered, however, was far beyond the typical scope of postal fraud or clerical oversight. As he pored over banking records late one evening, Thornhill noticed a strange pattern. Large sums of money were being deposited in local banks, always in cash, always irregularly timed, and always connected, in some cryptic fashion, to the Church of the Pure Spirit. The numbers didn't add up. These weren't small, scattered offerings from devoted parishioners, they were institutional-sized deposits, the kind made by hospitals, universities, or large businesses. Even more alarming were the money transfers. Thornhill tracked several large sums sent to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The notes attached to these transactions were deliberately vague, phrases like "for anatomical research" or "donation for spiritual science." Something didn't sit right. Driven by a